There are moments in a human life that divide existence into two parts: the years in which one walked asleep beneath a cloud, and the terrible holy hour in which the cloud broke apart and light fell upon everything at once. You who hear these words know something of that hour already. You have sensed, perhaps dimly, that much of your suffering was never accidental. Certain wounds arrived too precisely. Certain betrayals repeated themselves too perfectly. Certain people appeared in your life with smiles prepared like masks before a theater curtain. And because you possessed a conscience, because you still believed goodness was the natural language of mankind, you blamed yourself for what was done to you. But there are truths hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life, truths polite society avoids because they disturb the illusion that all hearts are fundamentally honest. The world has never been divided merely between the educated and the ignorant, nor between the powerful and the weak, but between those who can still feel the pain of another soul and those who have trained themselves not to feel it at all. A physician once confessed something remarkable, not publicly for publication. See, confessions are usually rehearsed performances. No, this was uttered quietly, as though the man himself feared the weight of his own realization. He had spent decades studying the body, examining symptoms, tracing invisible causes beneath visible suffering. Yet after years of observing people, he reached a conclusion more spiritual than medical. He said that certain souls arrive in this world carrying a peculiar light, and because of that light they become targets long before they understand why. You were never hated merely for your mistakes. Indeed, many who injured you were entirely comfortable with corruption, dishonesty, vanity, and cruelty when they found these qualities in themselves. No, what disturbed them was that you possessed something they could neither imitate nor destroy completely. Even in your exhaustion, even in your confusion, there remained within you an inconvenient reminder that goodness still existed. Such people often speak of sensitivity as though it were a defect. They say you care too much, feel too deeply, trust too sincerely. But consider how strange that accusation truly is. We do not mock the eye because it sees clearly, nor condemn the ear because it hears faithfully. Yet the modern world trains men and women to regard compassion as weakness because compassion exposes the poverty of loveless hearts. The doctor explained that trauma does not merely wound the emotions, it alters the architecture of perception itself. When a person is repeatedly deceived, abandoned, mocked, or manipulated, the soul begins to live in a state of permanent anticipation, like a village awaiting invasion. The nervous system becomes a watchman that never sleeps. One learns to detect danger in the smallest gestures, a pause in someone's voice, a shift in expression, the silence before rejection. And tragically, the wounded person often mistakes this condition for wisdom, believing vigilance alone can prevent further sorrow. But hypervigilance is not peace. It is survival disguised as maturity. And perhaps this explains why you have felt so weary even during quiet moments. Others assumed your fatigue came from overthinking, yet your exhaustion was born from carrying invisible armor day and night. You entered rooms prepared to defend yourself before anyone had spoken. You interpreted affection cautiously because love had once arrived carrying hidden knives. Even joy became suspicious to you because every happiness in your past seemed followed by punishment. The world rarely understands this burden. It praises productivity while ignoring the soul that has not rested in years. It encourages performance rather than healing. And so many chosen souls wander through life believing their inability to relax is evidence of personal failure, when in truth it is evidence of prolonged exposure to emotional warfare. The physician said something else that chilled the room into silence. He observed that manipulative individuals often possess an uncanny instinct for locating empathetic people. Like predators sensing movement in dark water, they are drawn toward kindness because kindness lowers its guard. And when they find such souls, they begin slowly rewriting the victim's understanding of reality itself. This is why you questioned your own perceptions for so long. A cruel person rarely announces himself with cruelty. Evil prefers camouflage. It enters wearing concern, affection, admiration, even vulnerability. It studies your loneliness. It memorizes your hopes. It learns the language your heart has longed to hear. Then gradually, almost imperceptibly, the manipulation begins. Your boundaries become unreasonable. Your pain becomes exaggeration. Your instincts become paranoia. And because you desire harmony, you continue giving the benefit of the doubt long after wisdom should have departed. There is a terrible loneliness in being psychologically wounded by someone others admire. It creates a prison without witnesses. You begin wondering whether the fault truly lies within you, because the outside world only sees the charming mask, your oppressor presence. Many chosen souls spent years apologizing for injuries they never caused, simply because they were too noble to imagine another human being could intentionally distort reality for personal gain. Yet reality, like sunlight beneath a door, always finds a way to enter eventually. And when truth finally arrives, it often comes with unbearable grief. For the awakening soul must mourn not only the damage itself, but the years spent denying what was happening. One realizes how much energy was consumed trying to earn love from people who had already decided to exploit it. One remembers conversations differently. Silences become meaningful, strange moments suddenly, and a line into horrifying clarity. You begin to understand that your confusion was never evidence of stupidity. It was evidence that your conscience could not naturally conceive such calculated deception. There are individuals who survive by feeding upon the emotional life of others. Not in some theatrical or supernatural sense, but in the deeply ordinary manner through which darkness most often operates. They require admiration to soothe their emptiness. They require control to silence their insecurity. They require your self-doubt because your confidence threatens the false identity they have built. And here lies the strange paradox. The stronger your inner light, the harder they work to convince you that you are weak. The doctor confessed that many chronic emotional conditions are rooted not merely in isolated incidents, but in prolonged exposure to spiritually corrosive environments. A soul cannot thrive where truth is punished. A heart cannot remain whole where love is continually weaponized. Some illnesses of despair emerge not because a person is broken by nature, but because they adapted for too long to circumstances no human being was designed to endure. Think of a flower, forced to grow beneath a stone. We would not blame the flower for bending strangely toward the smallest fragments of light. Yet countless people blame themselves for the distortions created by years of emotional starvation. You who listen tonight must understand something urgently. Your sensitivity was never the problem. Your longing for truth was never the problem. Your desire to see goodness in others was never the problem. The tragedy was that these sacred qualities were placed into the hands of those who viewed them as tools to exploit rather than treasures to protect. But there comes a moment, often after immense suffering, when the chosen soul begins reclaiming its sight. At first, the process feels cruel rather than liberating. One notices patterns previously ignored. One sees how certain people only approached when they needed strength, reassurance, validation, or rescue. One observes how quickly affection disappeared whenever boundaries appeared. And perhaps most painful of all, one realizes how often genuine kindness was met, not with gratitude, but with entitlement. The awakening can feel like losing faith in humanity itself. Yet this stage is necessary because false innocence must die before true wisdom can live. There is a counterfeit goodness that believes evil does not exist because acknowledging evil feels uncomfortable. But authentic goodness stares directly into corruption without becoming corrupted itself. It learns discernment. It understands that forgiveness and access are not identical things. It recognizes that loving others does not require surrendering one's soul to their dysfunction. The physician admitted that many spiritually gifted individuals endure years of isolation after awakening because they can no longer tolerate superficiality. Conversations that once seemed normal now feel exhausting. Crowds become overwhelming. Noise begins to wound the spirit. The soul starts craving sincerity with the desperation of a man crossing a desert craving water. And during this season, many mistakenly believe they are becoming cold. But there is a difference between becoming cold and becoming clear. A river becomes clearer when mud settles to the bottom. For years you were surrounded by voices demanding your constant availability, your endless forgiveness, your perpetual sacrifice. Yet few asked whether you yourself were safe, nourished, heard, understood, or loved. The chosen soul often learns to survive by becoming useful to others while secretly starving inwardly. And because usefulness earns temporary acceptance, one begins confusing usefulness with worth. But your worth was never dependent upon how much suffering you could endure silently. Hear this carefully. Some people were comfortable with your pain because your pain benefited them. Your confusion gave them power. Your insecurity gave them influence. Your exhaustion made you easier to control. And when you finally began healing, when you started questioning manipulation instead of absorbing it, their attitude changed instantly. Not because you became cruel, because you became difficult to dominate. This is why healing often provokes hostility from those who claim to love you. Your recovery interrupts systems built upon your self-abandonment. The moment you stop apologizing for existing, certain relationships begin collapsing beneath the weight of truth. And perhaps you have wondered recently why some individuals seem irritated by your peace, why your silence unsettles them, why your distance provokes accusations. It is because wounded manipulators depend upon emotional access. When they can no longer reach inside you and rearrange your emotions at will, they experience the terrifying sensation of losing control. The doctor spoke softly then, almost mournfully, and said that the saddest patients he encountered were not always those suffering physical illness, but those who had spent decades disconnected from their own inner voice. People who no longer trusted their instincts. People who apologized before speaking. People who had been conditioned to believe their deepest perceptions were unreliable. Such souls often arrive at middle age carrying invisible grief no medical instrument can measure. Yet the remarkable thing about the human spirit is this: truth, once awakened, rarely falls asleep again. Even after years of manipulation, something eternal within you continues resisting falsehood. A quiet voice persists beneath the noise. A sacred instinct survives beneath the conditioning. And eventually, after enough heartbreak, the soul begins choosing honesty over comfort. That choice changes everything. For once you begin honoring reality, your entire world reorganizes itself. You stop chasing people determined to misunderstand. And you stop begging for crumbs from tables where you once offered feasts. You stop translating your worth through the opinions of those incapable of recognizing it. And though the transition can feel unbearably lonely at first, it is often the first genuine freedom you have ever known. The chosen soul eventually discovers that solitude is far less painful than prolonged betrayal. And perhaps this is the hidden mercy within your suffering. It forced you to seek something deeper than approval. Had everyone embraced you easily, you might never have discovered the difference between performance and authenticity. Had you never been betrayed, you might never have learned the priceless value of discernment. Had you never walked through darkness, you might still mistake imitation light for the real thing. There are truths only suffering can teach, not because suffering itself is holy, but because illusions rarely survive inside it. And now, standing where you are, you may feel both exhausted and strangely awakened, as though some invisible veil has torn open before your eyes. The life you once accepted unquestioningly now appears filled with hidden motives and spiritual tensions you can no longer ignore. Even your past seems rewritten in this new light. Faces look different in memory. Conversations echo differently in your mind. And though part of you mourns the innocence you lost, another part realizes that innocence without discernment was never truly safety at all. It was merely vulnerability waiting to be discovered by the wrong hands. So do not despise yourself for awakening late. Many never awaken at all. Many spend entire lifetimes imprisoned within narratives written by manipulative people. Many die believing they were difficult, unworthy, overly emotional, or impossible to love, never realizing those identities were carefully planted inside them by those who feared their light. But you are beginning to see. And once a soul truly sees, the old chains no longer fit comfortably around the spirit. There is an agony that accompanies seeing clearly for the first time. The awakening soul often imagines enlightenment will feel triumphant, like the sudden arrival of a hero at the climax of a story. Yet genuine awakening is quieter and far more devastating. It resembles standing in the ruins of a house you spent years trying to repair, only to realize the foundation itself was poisoned from the beginning. The grief is not merely over what happened to you, but over how fiercely you tried to save what was never safe. And perhaps nowhere is this sorrow more painful than in the discovery that some people knew exactly what they were doing all along. You resisted this conclusion because your own conscience prevented you from imagining deliberate cruelty. You assumed confusion where there was calculation. You assumed weakness where there was manipulation. You assumed misunderstanding where there was intent. The pure-hearted often become prisoners of projection. They believe others operate from the same moral instincts they themselves possess. Thus they cannot easily recognize deceit, because deceit requires a level of internal division foreign to them. The doctor once described this condition as the tragedy of the morally sincere. He said the sincere soul continually searches for hidden goodness inside destructive people, while destructive people search for hidden vulnerabilities inside sincere souls. Consider how catastrophic such an imbalance becomes over time. One person enters the relationship hoping to understand, the other enters hoping to control. One desires mutual healing, The other desires emotional leverage. One speaks from the heart. The other studies the heart as a weapon map, and still you remained. Not because you were foolish, but because loyalty, once rooted deeply enough, becomes almost indistinguishable from faith. There are people listening now who stayed in damaging environments for years because they believed endurance itself was virtue. They mistook tolerance for love. They believed that if they could simply become more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, the darkness inside another person would finally soften. But one of the hardest truths the awakened soul must accept is this: your compassion cannot heal someone who profits emotionally from remaining wounded. Some individuals cling to their dysfunction because it grants them power. Victimhood excuses cruelty. Chaos attracts attention. Manipulation secures control. And whenever you attempted to introduce truth into such relationships, you unknowingly threatened the entire structure sustaining their identity. This explains why your honesty was often treated as aggression. Have you noticed how certain people become strange, jelly angry when you describe reality plainly? Not because your words are false, but because truth removes the protective fog they depend upon. Lies survive through confusion. Manipulators survive through contradiction, but clarity is merciless. It forces hidden things into visibility. It reveals patterns. It exposes motives. And once motives become visible, the spell begins breaking. The doctor confessed that some of the most psychologically damaged patients he encountered were not those openly abused, but those trapped in subtle emotional distortion for decades. People whose realities were continually minimized until they doubted their own memories. People praised publicly yet degraded privately. People emotionally starved while being told they were loved. Such contradictions fracture the human spirit because the soul depends upon coherence in order to feel safe. Imagine living in a room where the floor changes shape each night. Eventually, you would stop trusting your own balance. This is what emotional manipulation does. It destabilizes perception itself. You began apologizing not because you were always wrong, but because apology became the quickest path to temporary peace. You learned silence because speaking truth invited punishment. You learned to monitor facial expressions, tones, pauses, moods, and atmospheres because survival required anticipating emotional storms before they arrived. Others called you too sensitive, never realizing your sensitivity was forged through years of necessary vigilance. And perhaps the cruelest irony is this: the very adaptations that protected you in unhealthy environments now exhaust you in healthy ones. You remain alert even when no danger is present. You hesitate before trusting kindness because your past taught you that affection often concealed hidden conditions. You analyze harmless moments because your nervous system no longer believes peace can exist without consequences. The doctor said healing begins not when the wounded person learns to forget the past, but when they finally understand that their reactions were logical responses to prolonged instability. There is profound liberation in realizing you were not inherently defective. You were adapting to circumstances that distorted your natural state. A bird raised beneath constant thunder will tremble even beneath clear skies. But trembling does not mean, and the sky is dangerous. Many chosen souls spend years condemning themselves for symptoms that were never signs of weakness, but evidence of endurance. Your exhaustion was evidence of battle. Your anxiety was evidence of prolonged uncertainty. Your loneliness was evidence that your soul could no longer digest counterfeit intimacy. Even your breakdowns carried hidden intelligence. The spirit eventually rebels against living divided from truth, and this rebellion often appears first as collapse. You wondered why certain seasons of your life felt unbearably heavy, why motivation vanished, why your body ached without explanation, why even ordinary tasks became difficult. But the soul cannot endlessly carry unresolved grief without consequence. Human beings were not designed merely to survive emotionally poisonous environments indefinitely. Something eventually gives way. The body protests, the mind fragments, the spirit withdraws inwardly in search of shelter. Yet society, obsessed with appearances, often treats such collapse as personal failure rather than sacred warning. The physician spoke of patients whose illnesses improved only after they escaped environments of constant emotional hostility. He observed how the nervous system changes when no longer forced into perpetual defense. Sleep deepens, breath softens, memory sharpens, creativity returns. It is almost as though the soul begins cautiously emerging from hiding after years underground. Perhaps you have already tasted glimpses of this transformation yourself. Moments when silence suddenly felt peaceful rather than lonely. Moments when you realized you no longer feared someone's opinion as intensely as before. Moments when your laughter sounded genuine again, surprising even you. These are not insignificant occurrences. They are signs of resurrection within the inner life. But resurrection is rarely comfortable, for healing requires the chosen soul to relinquish familiar suffering. And strange as it may sound, familiar suffering can become addictive because at least it is predictable. Chaos, once normalized, feels safer than peace. This is why many people unconsciously return to destructive relationships repeatedly, not because they enjoy pain, but because their nervous systems mistake familiarity for security. The awakened soul must therefore learn an entirely new way of existing. One must cover how to live without constantly anticipating betrayal. One must relearn rest. One must relearn trust carefully, wisely, and without surrendering discernment. Above all, one must stop confusing love with self-erasure. That lesson alone changes destinies. For years you may have believed love meant enduring whatever another person inflicted. You may have assumed holiness required limitless tolerance. But genuine love does not demand the destruction of your spirit in order to preserve another person's comfort. There is nothing noble about remaining accessible to persistent cruelty. Mercy without wisdom becomes self-abandonment. The doctor admitted something profoundly unsettling. Many empathetic individuals unconsciously attract narcissistic personalities because empathy seeks understanding while narcissism seeks supply. One person asks, "How can I help you heal?" The other asks, "How much of your energy can I consume before you collapse?" Such dynamics can continue for years because the empathetic soul keeps interpreting exploitation as emotional need. And the manipulator encourages this interpretation deliberately. Notice how often they position themselves as misunderstood. D-victims. Notice how every confrontation somehow returned to their pain, their childhood, their stress, their wounds, their disappointments. Meanwhile, your suffering remained secondary, inconvenient, or invisible. You became caretaker, counselor, rescuer, emotional sponge. Yet whenever you yourself needed support, the atmosphere shifted strangely cold. Because some people enjoy receiving love far more than giving it. And when you finally grew exhausted, they accused you of changing. Of course you changed. Survival required it. A soul cannot endlessly bleed without eventually learning the necessity of boundaries. Even the gentlest creature bares its teeth when cornered long enough. Yet manipulative people often interpret boundaries as betrayal because boundaries interrupt access. They preferred the version of you that tolerated mistreatment silently. They preferred the exhausted version that doubted itself constantly. They preferred the wounded version because wounded people are easier to manage. Your healing threatens those who benefited from your confusion. This is why certain individuals disappeared once you began recovering. It was never your weakness they loved. It was why. Our availability. Once you stopped offering unconditional emotional labor while receiving little in return, the connection lost value to them. And painful though this realization may be, it contains hidden freedom. For it reveals which relationships were rooted in genuine care and which were sustained merely through your self-sacrifice. The doctor described healing as the gradual return of rightful ownership, ownership of thought, ownership of feeling, ownership of time, energy, attention, identity, and intuition. Trauma steals these things slowly. Manipulation fragments them. Fear distorts them. But truth begins gathering the scattered pieces back together. You may notice now how fiercely certain people resist your independence. They become uncomfortable when you trust your instincts. They mock your growth subtly. They minimize your insights. They question your memory. They speak nostalgically about the old you, though what they truly miss is your previous willingness to abandon yourself for their sake. Do not mistake this resistance for proof you are wrong. Sometimes opposition is confirmation that transformation is occurring. The chosen soul often feels profound guilt during healing because self-respect initially feels selfish after years of conditioning. Saying no feels cruel. Protecting your peace feels arrogant. Walking away feels disloyal. But consider the absurdity of this conditioning. You were taught to feel guilty for refusing your own destruction. No wonder your spirit grew weary. And yet, despite everything, there remains within you a remarkable tenderness that suffering failed to extinguish. This is perhaps the greatest mystery of all. Many who endure prolonged manipulation eventually become hardened, cynical, and emotionally unreachable. But chosen souls retain an unusual softness even after immense pain. They still ache for meaning. They still long for beauty. They still desire authentic connection. Their innocence becomes wounded, but not entirely annihilated. This is why darkness both fears and envies them. For there is something profoundly threatening about a soul that survives corruption without becoming corrupt itself. The physician once said he believed certain people carried what he called moral memory, an inward remembrance of truth deeper than societal conditioning. Such individuals cannot comfortably live divided again and nest their conscience forever. Even when they attempt compromise, something sacred within continues resisting falsehood. They feel physically ill in deceptive environments. They become restless around superficiality. They experience loneliness even in crowded rooms because their spirits hunger for authenticity beyond appearances. Perhaps you have experienced this your entire life without understanding it. You sensed insincerity quickly. You felt exhausted after certain interactions others seemed to enjoy. You intuitively recognized hidden tensions beneath polite conversations. And because society often dismisses intuitive perception as irrational, you learn to distrust your own discernment. But intuition is not madness. Sometimes it is the soul recognizing what the mind has not yet articulated. The doctor confessed that many emotionally intelligent people suffer deeply because they absorb atmospheres unconsciously. They feel the emotional temperature of rooms. They detect suppressed resentment, concealed hostility, unspoken sorrow. Yet because they cannot always explain these perceptions logically, they silence themselves. Over time, this self-silencing becomes internal exile. And nothing wounds the spirit more than exile from one's own truth. But listen carefully now. The reason your awakening feels so intense is because you are not merely recovering from individual betrayals. You are recovering from years of separation from yourself. Every moment you ignored your instincts to maintain peace cost you a fragment of inner trust. Every time you accepted mistreatment to avoid abandonment, the soul learned fear. Every time you denied your own pain because others minimized it, you drifted further from your center. Healing, therefore, is not becoming someone new. It is returning to the self that existed before fear convinced you to betray your own knowing. This return can feel frightening because authenticity rearranges relationships naturally. Some people will no longer recognize you. Others will accuse you of becoming distant, difficult, proud, or cold. But what they truly mean is that your spirit no longer bends as easily beneath manipulation. And though loneliness may accompany this transition, there is also a strange sacred peace within it. For the awakened soul eventually discovers that being misunderstood while honoring truth is far less painful than, and being accepted while betraying oneself. You are learning now to distinguish genuine love from emotional dependency. Genuine love nourishes freedom. Dependency fears it. Genuine love respects boundaries. Dependency resents them. Genuine love desires your wholeness. Dependency desires your usefulness. These distinctions may seem simple, yet they alter the entire course of a life once truly understood. And perhaps tonight, as these words settle within you, something ancient inside your spirit is beginning to awaken fully at last. Not rage alone, though anger has its rightful place. Not sorrow alone, though grief must be honored. But a deeper recognition. The recognition that your life was never meant to be spent shrinking yourself to accommodate the brokenness of others. The recognition that your empathy was a gift, not an invitation for exploitation. The recognition that survival is not the final purpose of existence, for beyond survival lies restoration. And restoration begins the moment you stop asking whether your pain was valid enough to deserve healing. And so, chosen one, do not leave this moment believing your story is merely about suffering. It is about awakening. It is about the terrible and beautiful transformation that occurs when a soul finally refuses to live in chains disguised as love. The wounds you carry were real. The confusion was real. The exhaustion was real. But so too is the strength that carried you through nights no one else fully understood. You were not losing your mind. You were losing illusions. And there is a sacred difference between the two. For every betrayal that tried to convince you that you were worthless, there remained something eternal within you that refused to die. Every manipulation, every dismissal, every silent cruelty was meant to disconnect you from your own light. Yet here you stand still searching for truth, still longing for meaning, still capable of love despite everything you endured. That alone is evidence that darkness did not succeed. The doctor's confession was never merely about what was done to you. It was about what survived within you after it was done. Others may never fully understand the battles you fought in silence. They may never know how many times you rebuilt yourself privately while smiling publicly. But heaven keeps account of invisible wars, and the soul that suffers without. Becoming cruel carries a kind of wisdom this world cannot manufacture. So stop mourning the version of yourself that tolerated destruction simply to keep others comfortable. That person was surviving, not living. Honor them for enduring what they did not yet know how to escape. But do not return to those chains simply because they are familiar. You are not here to spend the rest of your life begging to be chosen by people who only valued you when you abandoned yourself. You are here to remember who you were before fear taught you to shrink. And perhaps the greatest revelation of all is this: the very qualities they tried to break in you are the proof of who you truly are. Your empathy, your discernment, your depth, your hunger for truth, your refusal to become cold despite immense suffering. These were never weaknesses. They were signs that your soul belonged to something higher than manipulation, performance, and control. The world may reward masks for a season, but truth endures longer than every performance eventually. One day you will look back upon this painful chapter, not with shame, but with clarity. You will understand that what nearly destroyed you also awakened you. The betrayal taught discernment, the loneliness taught self-respect, the grief taught wisdom. And the silence through which you once wandered abandoned became the place where your spirit finally heard its own voice again. So walk forward now without apology, not hardened but wiser, not bitter but awake, not seeking revenge but refusing bondage. And when those who once underestimated your spirit look upon the peace you now carry, they will not understand how someone who endured so much could still stand with light in their eyes. But you will understand, because your survival was never merely human stubbornness. It was the quiet evidence that something sacred had been protecting your soul all along.